Thank you for joining me for this Lifeway study of the book of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. This is session 3. The text is Joshua chapter 3, verse 14 through chapter 4, verse 9. The title of the lesson is Remembering God's Works. And the lesson summary statement is something different that I've written instead of what's recorded in the material. Here is my lesson summary statement. Remembering helps us stay mindful of God's presence and power at every turn. Remembering helps us stay mindful of God's presence and power at every turn. That's what I hope to communicate in my lesson. Now, to start the lesson, I'm going to tell them about my experience as a young man, a high school and college man. I delivered tools in the oil field, and I would go into some of the small communities in Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle. And many of those communities had memorials that they had erected for young men who left those communities to fight in World War I and in World War II. It was very powerful to see the number of young men that from a little community, a little country community like Fargo, Oklahoma, had so many young men who gave their lives in the fight in World War I. I've been to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., and you may have as well. It's two black panels of granite. They're almost 300 feet long, just something just short of that. The black granite came from India. You can imagine how much that must have cost and how long that was. But they start at ground level, and it's only 8 inches high, and then it begins to increase in height to where when you get to the middle where the two walls join together, it's over 10 feet high. There are 58,300 plus names on the Vietnam Memorial. The way they designed it is you start at ground level and you go down and then you go up the other side. And it was to represent a wound that is healing. It is very powerful. It's almost a place of reverence and worship when you come to this memorial, as people are looking at the names, and there are some who are looking for specific names. When you stand in front of a memorial like those in the small communities, or in your community, or at the Vietnam Memorial, things like that, when you see those names, what are some of the thoughts that you have? That's what I'm asking the class. I think about, they're so young. So many of these were teenagers or young 20-year-olds, mid 20-year-olds. They're so young. I think about the great loss of potential for good in our society. What some of these young men and women would have become. I just think, what a terrible loss. I think about the agony that must have happened when the news was delivered to the family. I think about the bravery and the heroism of these young adults. Where do you find people like this who will do the things that they did? So I want the class to engage and talk with me about their thoughts about memorials. That memorials are not just reminders. They are messages too. Messages like, don't take your freedoms, your liberties lightly. In the movie Saving Private Ryan, the Tom Hanks character at the end of the movie has been fatally wounded, and he has successfully rescued the Private Ryan that they've gone for, and he pulls him in close to him, and he says, earn this, earn this. And at the end of the movie, an aged Private Ryan goes to the cemetery to recognize this captain that had given his life for him, and he's kneeling at that cross, and he says to his wife, have I been a good man? And he's wanting to know, have I earned this? They're powerful reminders, but they're also powerful messages. In the same way that our memorials remind us of what we are and how we got here, so do the memorials in the Bible. Now, to give the class a sense of context where we are, I'm going to write some words on the board and use that to just kind of walk through the context of where we're at in this particular passage. I have the word successor, Deuteronomy 31. That refers to the fact that Joshua becomes Moses' successor. I have Moses' farewell, Deuteronomy 32 to 34. That's where Moses gives his last message and then he dies. And then there's Joshua chapter 1, and Joshua encourages, the Lord encourages Joshua to be the leader. And then last week there's Rahab. God uses unusual people, unlikely people, to accomplish his plans. That's Joshua 2. And then Joshua 3 and 4, where we're at this Sunday, that's them crossing the Jordan River at flood stage. And then once they get on the other side in Joshua 5, they have their first Passover meal in the promised land. And they begin to eat from the produce of the land, and the manna stops flowing at that time. And then, of course, Joshua chapter 6, I have here Jericho conquered, and that is going to be the magnificent story of God's great victory over Jericho. And I want the class to kind of see the picture of where we're at instead of it just being kind of an isolated passage of story. So the first point is dry ground. And the truth that I'm driving at is remembering helps us stay mindful of God's presence and power at every turn. I want to read through the text and give some background to it, and then I have some follow-up questions in terms of application. So when I read through this, it says, verse 14, when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan. Just think about what that means. They've been 40 years in the desert waiting to accomplish what the first generation failed to do. The promise is not just 40 years old. The promises go back to Abraham. It's almost 500 years from this point that they're at. So this is a moment that is filled with excitement and anticipation. They're about to see the fulfillment promised. The priests carried the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people. The Ark of the Covenant was representative of the presence of God, and they were told to keep a distance of a half a mile from the Ark of the Covenant. They were to keep it in sight, so they were to follow the Lord, but they were also to remember the kind of God that they're following, a God of holiness, a God of righteousness. Verse 15, now the Jordan overflows its bank throughout the harvest season. It would help you in your explanation of the text, do a little bit of study on the Jordan River and what happens at flood season. The word Jordan means descender, and it's referring to the rapid descent that it makes. It starts out in the Mount Hermon, and that's 1,000 feet above sea level, and where it starts, and then it flows down through this chute in the earth to the Dead Sea, which is 1,300 feet below sea level. Now, if you take a straight line, it's 75 miles, but the Jordan River most of the year just kind of meanders, and that's about 200 miles. Typically, the Jordan River, at its very widest, is 100 feet, and it may be anywhere from 3 to 10 feet deep. But in flood season, when the snows are melting on the mountain and the rainy season comes, the Jordan River can become a roaring torrent of water. It goes from 3 to 10 feet deep to 16 to 20 feet deep. It goes from 100 feet wide to some places a mile wide. It increases in size by 50 times. The force of the Jordan River at flood time is so powerful that it has been known to roll boulders down the river. We saw last week a flood in Waco, Texas, and they videotaped an automobile floating down one of the streets where they're in Waco, Texas. That's the power of water. So if you're going to cross the Jordan River, this is absolutely the worst time to do it. Wait till the dry season. Wait till the winter time when everyone can step across it. So But this is when God has brought them to the Jordan River. It goes on to say, but as soon as the priests carrying the ark reached the Jordan, their feet touched the water at its edge, and the water flowing downstream stood still, rising up in a mass that extended as far as Adam, a city next to Zarethan. The water flowing downstream into the Sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off, and the people crossed opposite Jericho. Now that's a distance of 18 to 20 miles. So you have this wide path in order for 2 million people to get across. Verse 17, the priest carrying the ark of the Lord's covenant stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan. They didn't stand in mud. It was drowned. So as the water receded, the ground dried. It's just a work of God. While all Israel crossed on dry ground until the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan. That's quite a statement. And we know there are 2.5 tribes that remained on the other side of the Jordan, but their warriors had gone ahead of them into there. But all of the nation of Israel was on the west side. Now, how do you go about applying this? I have 3 questions that I want to talk to the class about barriers. We're all faced with barriers. Barriers are important. For example, question number 1, how do barriers force us to trust God instead of ourselves? And what I'm wanting to lead the class to see is that a barrier confronts us with our inabilities. It forces us to deal with self-reliance. Think about the Israelites here. Did they have any skill that was going to get them across the Jordan River? Not at all. Did they have a plan that would get them across? Not at all. There was no way they were going to get there. If they're ever going to cross the Jordan, they're going to have to trust God. That's what I'm wanting to drive at. I'm wanting to have a discussion about. A second thing, what do barriers reveal about our faith? What do barriers reveal about our faith? Now, what I'm wanting to say is what the barrier does is it exposes what we truly believe about God. For example, the Jordan exposed whether Israel believed God's promise enough to obey him. Because faith isn't proved on dry ground, it's proved at the riverbank. So what do barriers reveal about our faith? That's the thing I'm wanting to have a discussion about. The third question I have is, what do barriers reveal? How do barriers deepen our faith? And what a barrier does is it causes us to experience God's power, maybe in a fresh way or a new way or an old way we've forgotten. But it causes us to experience God's way, and it gives us strength and comfort. And so I'm wanting to have that kind of discussion. Barriers have the value of deepening our faith, of revealing our faith, of forcing us to trust God instead of trusting ourselves. So I'm wanting to establish that kind of thinking. And then I have this for the class. Notice that the point says dry ground. What dry ground moment from your past reminds you that God never fails his people? It's that moment when you say, if God had not stepped in, I would not have made it. So I'm wanting to take these thoughts and make them personal to them. It could be something that on a relationship basis, it could be something that deals with their occupation, their vocation. It may have something to do with finances or health or fear or whatever it was. It forced them to trust God. I'd like to have some testimonies about that. Barriers. The second point is memorial stones, chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. Again, I want to read through the text and give some explanation that's involved in that text, and I'm sure you have things from your study that you'd like to share with them. But when it comes to the application, our church is our youth are going to be going, to a youth camp here in Oklahoma called Falls Creek. And it's going to be a powerful experience for many of them. It will become a milestone in their life. For many of the youth, and all of the youth we're praying for, that they will have an encounter with God. So I'm asking the class, how can they take this experience with God, this powerful movement, and use it, find a way to make a memorial stone that will take them back to it again and again, so that they can remember God's presence and power at that moment. For example, I'm saying, how could they use a written letter as a memorial stone? How could they use a written letter as a memorial stone? One of the ideas is, I may suggest this to our youth minister, is at the end of the week, have each youth write themselves a letter. The youth minister collect it, hold on to it for a month, and then mail it to each of them as a reminder. Or maybe there would be other ways they could use a letter. Maybe they use a letter as a testimony they write to somebody else. I'm just saying, what I'm trying to do is give the class eventually some ideas on how they could do memorials. What object could the youth use from Falls Creek that would be a reminder of their experience of the presence and the power of God? They all have to have a wristband that identifies them as being on that, they're legitimate to be on that campus. They may want to take that wristband and put it someplace in their bedroom where it reminds them that this is what happened this past week. There's photos that they take that they want to remember. Maybe the study book they use, they make a commitment to go through it each Sunday afternoon for a month. So I'm just trying to create these kinds of ideas from the class. And then I just say, what are some other ways that the youth could build a memorial for their experience of God's presence and power at camp? And things like just faithfully attend church, making a public commitment of your dedication to the Lord, share their testimony of what God did in their life with the youth group, or with their Sunday school class, or with their friends. Maybe they could use Post-it notes that had the camp scripture on it, and they post it, and it causes them to see it when they're taking their bath and those kinds of things. I'm just saying, what are some things, some memorial stones that could be erected? And then to close it out, I want to say, what story from your life would you want your grandchildren to know so they understand who God has been to you? What story from your life would you want your grandchildren to know so they understand what God has been to you? Now, just three that I could just mention briefly. My son Daniel, that died just shortly after his birth, and how God comforted my wife and I. He was very real to us. My dad and his salvation. I prayed for my father for 22 years to come to faith in Christ. And he shared with me one time after the funeral of one of his friends that he had made that decision. And I could go into the powerful moment that was for me and him. There's Africa. Several years ago, I was on a mission trip to Africa, and God met me in a very, very real way. So I'm just saying, those are stories that I want my grandchildren to know, because God was very real. I experienced his presence and his power. The last point is lasting reminders. And again, I want to go through the text, reading it, engaging it with the class, giving some explanations that are necessary. And then here's how I want to apply it. The miracle is behind the Israelites. And now God wants the memory of what had taken place to be preserved. He didn't bring them to the Jordan River to drown them. He brought them to the Jordan River to show them his power and his presence. He wants them to stay mindful that he is present and he is powerful at every turn. They're going to need to know that as they face the challenges in the promised land. In my office, across from my desk, my wife had a picture made for me to remind me of my experience that I had in Africa. It's beautiful. This is very powerful. It says Jesus, and then down here it says he is alive. And that goes with this experience that I had in Africa. It's right across from me, so that every once in a while I look up at it, I concentrate on it, and I am reminded of the power of God to comfort me, to strengthen me, and to use me. And I'm wanting to ask the class, do you have something similar? I want to solicit to class. Is there something, it doesn't have to be this, but something they look at, something they remember, and it brings back to them that God is present and God is powerful, and they experience that. So here's my assignment as the class concludes. Find something that you're going to use as a memorial. It may not be something as permanent or as expensive or as beautiful as this. It could be something very simple, but something they're going to use this week as a memorial to remind them of an encounter with the living God, where he showed that he was powerful and he was present, and they experienced that. And then I want to ask them, would you come back next week and would some of you share with us how you created a memorial to one of those powerful experiences that you want to be something that's passed down to your children and your grandchildren. This is such a good lesson, such a powerful lesson, and God bless you for teaching it.